Hi, I'm Tom Payton, Director and Publisher at Trinity University Press. Thanks for joining us for the Maverick Book Club, a quarterly event series exploring the rich stories about Texas, especially our hometown of San Antonio. As a nonprofit, cultural, and educational publisher, we're committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together productively as a community, as we hope that you'll find in this discussion. Brackenridge Park began its life as a heavily wooded, bucolic park at the turn of the 20th century. Over the next 120 years, it has evolved into the sprawling, multifaceted jewel San Antonians enjoy today, home to San Antonio Zoo, the state's first public golf course, Japanese tea garden, sunken garden theater, and the Whitty Museum. The land that Brackenridge Park occupies near the San Antonio River headwaters has been reinvented many times. People have gathered there since prehistoric times. Following the city's founding in 1718, the land was used to channel river water into town via a system of acequias. Its limestone cliffs were quarried for building materials. It was the site of a Civil War tannery, headquarters for 2 military camps, a plant nursery, and even a racetrack. Over the more than 400 acres that constitutes San Antonio's flagship urban park are made up of half a dozen parcels stitched together over time to create an uncommon landscape. Uniquely San Antonian, Brackenridge is full of romantic wooded walks and whimsical public spaces that draw tourists, locals, wildlife, and waterfowl alike. We're here now to discuss the new book, Brackenridge, San Antonio's Acclaimed Urban Park by historian Lewis Fisher. I'll pause for a second to remember when I first met Lewis and Mary Fisher so many years ago, and that turned into a lively discussion about Lewis's legacy as a journalist turned book author and publisher. It wasn't long before he and I engaged in discussions about Trinity University Press buying his much-loved locally and nationally Maverick Publishing Company. I'm immensely proud that we made that arrangement, along with our decision following to establish a new imprint, Maverick Books, in honor of what he and Mary had built. Lewis has authored many important books about the history of San Antonio, and this new book, Brackenridge, sets the highest standard yet. Extensively researched and lavishly illustrated, it is the first comprehensive look at the diverse, fascinating story of this historic park, while it also shines a light on its national significance. Lewis is joined in our discussion by also loved writer and journalist Randy Beamer. With more than 40 years in news, he was the News 4 San Antonio weeknight news anchor for more than 25 years, and he's won 9 Emmy Awards. He's currently the host of On the Record on KLRN. Thank you, Randy, for participating today. You can order the book, Brackenridge, by using the link in the screen chat you'll see during the program, or by visiting us at tupress.org. And you'll also get a 20% discount if you use the promo code MAV10, MAV10 at checkout. And now, please join us in welcoming Randy Beamer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Payton. Appreciate it. I hope you can hear me, and Lewis there. I am not great at technical stuff, but we are honored. I'm honored to be part of this because I've interviewed Lewis Fisher before on a number of books. There was American Venice I have, and Saving San Antonio I have, and he has been so gracious. And then on this book, this great book on Brackenridge Park, I interviewed him after I learned that he was writing a book. And then I interviewed him for a very long time, and I'm doing a thing for KLRN, and it is just great to find out so much information. And I think, like him, I didn't know anything about Brackenridge Park or about all of this. And Lewis, if we can bring you in here now, I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you just fine.
What is it that struck you about Brackenridge Park? How did you first get into this project? And I know then it mushroomed for you. You said it took a lot longer to write than you thought it was going to.
Well, it seemed like a fairly simple project, something that take about 6 months. Everybody knows Brackenridge Park. We kind of treat it like an old shoe, and what more can be said about it than a few more words, maybe about the sunken garden or the river or whatever. And as I got into it, I found that it was going to take more than 6 months. It ended up taking 2 years. I happen to also be a member of the board of the Brackenridge Park Conservancy, which gave me another insight into the efforts that are being made to improve the park and some of the challenges. And I guess I sort of got a sense of mission about the project.
And there was a lot more meat to it, a lot more history maybe than you expected. What were the big surprises as people join us now and think, well, wait, a book about a park, what can be a surprise?
Well, that's what I thought, but it's like so much else in San Antonio. That's what's so much fun writing about San Antonio, because here we have one of the most historic cities in Texas, if not the most, and so little is actually known about it because people went along, they had a good time, and didn't take much note of writing things down. So tall tales evolved. And as you start getting behind the kernel of truth behind most of the tall tales, you start finding a lot more substance than you had any idea was there.
And there was a cultural landscape report that came out in 2017, I think,
Yes.
by a group of outside experts who didn't know anything about Brackenridge Park, but knew a lot about other parks, and were stunned to find out some of the history and how Brackenridge really mirrored the development. Things in Brackenridge Park told the story of San Antonio because of where it is, by the headwaters of the river.
Yes, Brackenridge Park never got any respect from experts outside San Antonio. National landmark or landscape architects and authorities didn't really think too much of the park, because unlike other major parks in cities in the country, there was no major designer of Brackenridge Park. No marquee architect like Frederick Law Olmsted in Central Park. There were great designs of parks in Dallas and Houston, where boulevards and gardens and plans were laid out in a very logical manner. But Brackenridge Park just sort of happened as kind of a crazy quilt development. Things just sort of evolved. And so when the Conservancy was organized, when it was finally realized that Brackenridge Park needed a lot of help, more than any other organization could provide. And the Brackenridge Park Conservancy was actually created by the Conservation Society in 2008. And a sort of an intervention was held about 5 years ago, where landscape architects from throughout the country, under the guise, the aegis of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., when these folks congregated in San Antonio and looked at Brackenridge Park, many for the first time, they suddenly discovered that not only does Brackenridge Park work as a park, but it has a rather unusual layering that happens to reflect the evolution of the city of San Antonio in a way that major parks by major designers elsewhere in the country do not. You know, they didn't just go outside the city, find 100 acres and put something on it. It ended up being created near the headwaters of the San Antonio River, where so much has happened that these layers are still extant. They're still visible. They contribute to the park, and these authorities suddenly realized that Brackenridge Park is one of the most outstanding urban cultural parks in America.
And some of those layers, let's start, say, chronologically. Some are still being discovered. For example, the Spanish colonial dam was just discovered in '95, one of them. But even farther beyond, every time they do the dig in Brackenridge Park, a dig, Kay Hines, one of the archaeologists, says they discover something else, and she thinks if they dig down deep enough, they'll get 12,000 plus years back.
Yes, well, I think they have in some cases. Brackenridge Park is essentially a large archaeological site. There are other archaeological sites in Bexar County which are significant, but there is no other location in the county where the entire sweep, practically, of ancient history of Native American habitation exists as it does in Brackenridge Park. So it's very easy to come up with artifacts of the prehistoric times.
And there were different Native American groups in and around Brackenridge Park. even through the early days of Spanish colonial era and then into the Republic of Texas era.
That's right. And what actually drew them to Brackenridge Park was the water of the San Antonio River. So the San Antonio River flows through a very narrow valley, which is surrounded by, well, in three ecological zones, one of which is the Chihuahuan Desert, obviously very dry. And so this was a natural stopping point or passing through point for Native Americans. And when the Spaniards came looking for a way station between the missions and the North Texas, Louisiana border and the Rio Grande, San Antonio was a very logical place to come and set up. And so,
we think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, so they to get water, which was the first need for the residents of the new city. When San Antonio was founded in 1718, a year later, the first of two acequias in Brackenridge Park was created. A dam was built to divert water downstream, gravitational flow, to serve the present location of the Alamo Mission, the farmlands in between. And then a second acequia was established in July 1776, believe it or not on the 4th, but on the 23rd or something like that. And that also furnished water for the critical water for the city. And when the city began to grow uphill, and gravity does not drive water uphill, the first modern waterworks was created for San Antonio, and in 1878, the first pump house was built in Brackenridge Park.
And even before we get to some of that, now the Native Americans, we think of them as nomadic hunter-gatherers, but there's more and more archaeological evidence that those along the river, in the park, and elsewhere down south actually lived there for some time and were building hearths and weren't as nomadic as we thought.
Well, they could hunt and they could gather. It was a great place for crops and for hunting, fishing. They could do it all. They could really sustain themselves very nicely here.
And when the Spanish came in 1718, they built their first encampment, I guess you'd say, over by San Pedro Creek.
Correct.
And there were people living all around, Native Americans all around, and they, I don't say use those people, but those are the people that dug the acequias and did the hard lifting and the heavy work. Ricardo Romo calls them the founders, really, of the city.
Right. The Spaniards had a royal engineer who came and who instructed them, but they did the heavy lifting and the digging that was necessary to sustain the town.
And what can you see that people might not realize still in the park from that era?
Well, the park has some very strange boundaries, and one of them is at the western end of the park, where there's a miniature or a golf driving range right now. Seems to be a very ragged boundary. That is actually the route of one of the acequias. The land was divided east of the acequia, other landowners on the other side, and so that is actually a visible remnant of the acequias. You mentioned that one of the acequia dams, the Upper Labor Dam, was discovered in 1995 by an architect who was walking around the upper part of the park after a heavy rain and saw some rocks that weren't supposed to be there. It was the location of the Spanish dam. Everybody thought the dam was long gone. And lo and behold, there were the remnants of that. And that is a real Spanish colonial landmark, as important as, say, Espada Dam, which has been one of the great tourist attractions of San Antonio for some time, and other relics of the era.
And that Upper Labor Dam, it fed an acequia or irrigation canal to the west of the river and down toward San Pedro Creek and what was west of San Antonio. And what's left of it still goes through the zoo, and you can see, I guess, depressions down farther.
There is the flamingos in the zoo are actually have a habitat in one of those ponds right now that was part of the original route of the acequia. The acequias themselves were closed at the turn of the 20th century, and there are only remnants remaining. But that is one remnant right very close to home in Brackenridge Park. Mm-hmm.
And also through the Whitty, the other one, the upper, or the Madre,
the Alamo
Madre.
Yes, the Alamo acequia. Yes, that when the Whitty did its renovation and expansion, they were very careful to mark the route of the acequia through the Whitty grounds, and as it crossed under where one of the buildings is and emerged toward the street, the sidewalk has special paving stones to indicate where the acequia flowed.
And in the book, you do a great job of talking about the different eras of San Antonio, and after the Spanish colonial era, and when I guess the missions were secularized, there wasn't much written about what might have happened in Brackenridge Park for a certain amount of time. But then again, there was suddenly. What did you find out about those eras?
Well, there wasn't, as you suggested, there really wasn't much to find out because not much was written in the period of San Antonio during the Republic of Texas and the Mexican War. This was actually a dangerous place to be because the Mexican army did invade Texas on several occasions and take some San Antonians back to Mexico with them for various periods of time. But as things settled down, as the war ended, there was a period of great growth in San Antonio, and then, of course, we very shortly came right up to the Civil War, and Texas left the Union and joined the South, and the Confederacy really needed a good spot. We were west of the Mississippi, and once the Union Army split the Confederacy down the middle by getting control, or almost down the middle by getting control of the Mississippi, there were 50,000 Confederate soldiers stationed west of the Mississippi River, the majority of them, or a large number of them, in Texas, and they needed supplies. So San Antonio ended up being picked as the site for a major Confederate tannery to supply leather for saddles and harnesses and shoes and boots for the soldiers. And there were also plans for a cotton factory and a woolen mill and various other enterprises. In 1863, the Major Thornton Washington, a great grandnephew of George Washington, negotiated with the city for the sale to the Confederate government of 78 acres in Brackenridge Park. That's 20% of the park, pretty much. And that is where the tannery was built in Brackenridge Park, using water from the upper Labor Acequia and the San Antonio River. It was a tract between the Acequia and the river. And that became an important section of the park as the Confederacy was defeated, and the city regained control of the land. Some of the property was sold. It became a nursery, one of the largest nurseries in Texas, and as the George Brackenridge, when the water supply went from just the river itself, and you no longer had the river powering pumps to pump river water up to the reservoir, you had artesian wells dug. George Brackenridge, who controlled the San Antonio Waterworks Company, no longer needed the land that had supported the waterworks, and so he gave that land, about 200 acres, to the city of San Antonio in 1899.
And that was the basis of the park, but it was all land east of the river that he owned, including up to in the headwaters that's now in Incarnate Word.
Correct. Yes, it was from the upper Labor, or from the San Antonio River to Broadway, but that left the land from the San Antonio River west to the Upper Labor Acequia, which is where this nursery was flourishing, one of the largest in the state. That closed. There's a lot of drama in Brackenridge Park. For instance,
Yes, there is.
The owner of the nursery, a lady, lived in the nursery, near the nursery. She was murdered and her home was set on fire to cover the crime. So obviously the nursery also did not survive. And in 1901, as Brackenridge Park was beginning to open to the public, George Brackenridge was a prohibitionist, and he forbade the use of alcoholic beverages in his park.
Even though he actually had a penchant for whiskey, you said?
He did. He did not trust others to be able to control their whiskey the way that he could. And so he thought it was very dangerous to have that consumption of alcohol in a park. But right down the river, of course, we had no one but Otto Kaler, who had the Pearl Brewery, was one of the largest in Texas. And Otto Kaler took a look at this old nursery tract right across the river from Brackenridge Park, and he bought it. And he opened essentially a beer garden to sell Pearl beer, so that anybody in Brackenridge Park who was thirsty for some beer, all he had to do was cross the river and go to his beer garden.
And
so
it wasn't part of his brewery.
No,
it was just a beer garden where you could go up.
Beer garden, and it was a family park. He had an existing park. He didn't name it for himself because he didn't want to. I suppose he didn't want to compete with George Brackenridge, go head to head with him. But
and people would go up. I guess it was called Rock Quarry Road at that time because
yes,
the quarries were there since the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have to go up on that side. There wasn't a lot of access to this whole area back in the day, even through the early 1900s, right?
Right. You had Broadway, which was River Road. That was the main artery. But Brackenridge, he had some problems with trusting people to do a lot of things. He did not trust the city to keep parkland that was in a prime retail location. So he did not give the land directly beside Broadway to the city. He kept back about a 250-foot depth along Broadway to along the eastern part of the park, and kept that in the ownership of the waterworks, so the city would not be tempted to sell it. And that's why we have so many buildings along the park, hiding the park and keeping the park from really being visible to the public, with just one or two exceptions.
And now it brings up, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, it brings up about George Brackenridge himself, who you said is really an enigma, this figure who was a Union supporter from East Texas, made some money running cotton across to Mexico. Tell us about what you found out about George Brackenridge.
Well, as you said, he was a Union sympathizer, a Union loyalist during the Civil War. He had grown up in East Texas, but he had been a Union official in New Orleans during the Civil War. After the war, he could not go back to his home in East Texas because they would hang a Union loyalist. The closest he could get to East Texas was San Antonio, which was kind of a mix between East and West, and which actually had voted against secession. So he came back to San Antonio after the Civil War, having made a fortune in cotton smuggling, getting cotton out of the South and selling it up to the North. And he opened a bank in San Antonio, the San Antonio National Bank. When the U.S. Army returned to San Antonio in 1866, and they were looking for a place to keep their money, who do they pick but good old Union loyalist George? And his bank became the largest repository, the largest dependable source of capital for people who were building San Antonio after the war. And he made another fortune in backing cattlemen, sending cattle up the Chisholm Trail to markets and railheads in Kansas.
And that one of the big buildings downtown, Pat Maloney's office now was part of his first bank, right? I guess he
Yes,
built that
a
building.
Moorish style building. Again, not a very conventional type of structure. Very elegant. It's part of what lends the diversity to the facade, the viewscape of San Antonio is this Moorish tower and elegant entrance on Commerce Street. But that was his bank.
And about that time, talk about reflecting what happened in San Antonio, some of the German influence in San Antonio in terms of the quarries showed up in some of that Confederate addition to the acequia. They did some work on top of the old Spanish colonial acequias.
Yes, it did. In addition to water, the rock at Brackenridge Park was very important to the city. We were right at the edge of an uplift to the Edwards, at the edge of the Edwards Aquifer, and there are limestone cliffs that are very easy to cut rock from. And so two things happened, one of which was the rock was cut and turned into lime and was used for many of the early buildings for San Antonio. And when the tannery was established, the engineers, Major Washington was a graduate of West Point, which stressed engineering at the time. He actually raised the level of the Spanish Dam and built some sluiceways to serve the tannery. But also, then John H. Campman, one of the city's leading contractors and builders, bought a slice of the quarry and used that to furnish rock and building materials for some of the fine landmark homes and buildings that we now enjoy in San Antonio.
In the park now, you can see some of that Confederate stonework and the sluiceways and the raceway, I guess, that they may have worked on later, but some of that you can see, and it's being unearthed, and it's part of the renovation, as I understand it, that they hope to complete over the next 20 or 30 years.
Yes, one of the most historic parts of the park, obviously, is that area between the Spanish Colonial Dam and the pump house. It's roughly between Hildebrand Avenue on the north and a bend of the San Antonio River on the south. A lot happened there. The waterworks, the tannery was right nearby. It's one of the most confusing and unsightly areas of the park right now. Just a lot of dry ditches running this way and that. But there was about $12 million raised in the 2017 bond issue, and another couple of million raised by the Brackenridge Park Conservancy and contributed by the county and others to actually restore I think it's about 10 acres around the pump house and the dam. HEB has contributed $1 million for a trail that will lead along the side of the river. That will put water back into the original raceway for the pump house, restore the pump house, and also reconstruct using some of the rock that was uncovered from one of the Confederate sluiceways. Use some of the rock as sort of a visual reminder of the existence of the tannery.
And some of that work's been delayed because of the controversy right now over trees and removal of X number of trees, but that's now going to the state, and that should be resolved soon.
Yes, it should be within a period of months. We should, at long last, see some groundbreaking, and I think it will be one of the most outstanding areas of the city. The Conservancy works much the way the San Antonio River Foundation worked with the development of the Mission Reach and the Museum Reach on the San Antonio Riverwalk. City funds can be justified for the basics, for a concrete channel and a few bridges, but for the things that really add the elements that really make something look really sharp, you have to go to private funding, and that's what the Conservancy has done, and that's what you'll see in this northern area of the park. Some really wonderful, I hate to use the term state of the art because everybody uses it, but basically it will be a very very distinctive area of the park, and then rest will develop later.
a little bit more of the Civil War era, because what you uncovered, I think, is just fantastic. And I'm not sure how you got a lot of information on just how big the building was, the fact that that 70 some acres was meant to be a big
Uh,
industrial complex, but they never got there. And how did you get that information?
Well, this is where I realized I was getting into deep trouble with doing a quick project. Um, I got in touch with the National Archives in Washington, and an archivist up there gave me a link to a seldom studied file of the papers of Thornton, Washington, which included a lot of the records of the Confederate tannery, how the structures were built, how the tanning vats were constructed. There were about 100 tanning vats, for instance, in a frame building between just south of or east of the Upper Labor Acequia. The water came down the acequia into the tanning vats and the various processes of tanning that were used. And then the effluent ran out to, of course, down into the San Antonio River and went downstream. But that was a project that was fraught with all the problems the Confederacy had. At first, they had enslaved workers whom they paid. They actually paid a plantation owner near Seguin for the use of 40 enslaved workers. Then they couldn't afford it anymore. They conscripted Confederate soldiers to operate the tannery, and they got some hazardous duty pay. It's not a very pleasant process. It doesn't smell very good, so that's why it's good. It was outside of town. And then, of course, it finally closed, but the tannery itself, and we've got maps of what it looked like. The tannery itself occupied only about 10 of those 78 acres. The remainder, they never really were able to do anything with.
But they were looking to fortify not just that area, but other parts of San Antonio.
Well, there was a Union army that landed down near the border,
Brownsville,
north of
right?
Matamoros, right, Brownsville, and there was a fear, a scare of an invasion coming to San Antonio, and there were actually plans begun to fortify the tannery in Brackenridge Park. We almost had ruins of a fort in Brackenridge Park until they finally realized or pretty quickly realized that it was indefensible. It was too flat, and so the idea was to move everything downtown to a more defensible area if that happened.
After the Civil War, there was a little bit of, I guess, a legal battle, but the city wound up with it after the Freedmen's Bureau had it for a while. How did that work?
Yeah, well, the Confederate government bought the land from the city of San Antonio. And after the war, the Confederacy was defeated. Confederate properties were given to first an agency of the U.S. Army and then of the federal government called the Freedmen's Bureau. There's a longer name for it, but basically it was an agency that was to aid the former enslaved workers who were freed and to help them get adjusted into their new surroundings. There were three commissioners of the Freedmen's Bureau in San Antonio, one of whom was George Brackenridge. They took, the city of San Antonio bought the tannery back from the Freedmen's Bureau, and some of the rocks from some of the buildings of the tannery were used to build the first public school the first school for Black children in San Antonio.
And he was quite a philanthropist even before he gave the land to the city, and had a number of different interests that people might be surprised that someone in San Antonio
he did, and they tended to be rather forward-looking, and he was actually in some ways out of step with the good time entertainning entertainers or the people who were having fun in San Antonio. He was raised as a rigid Presbyterian, but nevertheless he had some other interests. He gave one plot just north of where the Woody Museum is now to the Salvation Army as a home for unwed mothers. that was after the park had been established. Well, some of the, quote, Puritan types in San Antonio were enraged that such an establishment for fallen women would be next to a park. And they got the city to sue the courts and force the Salvation Army to not build it, but the city lost. And George Brackenridge then, he helped fund the construction of the Salvation Army home on that site. Not something.
And then the Brackenridge Villa, I guess part of that area was owned by a city alderman, Sweet, who got a sweet deal on it, and he built that home.
Yeah, the city of San Antonio, in those times especially, was always looking for a way to get a few more bucks to float the city. The German residents especially were very thrifty. They did not see the value of raising taxes or even of paying taxes. And so the city at one point sold the land to around the headwaters of the river to a former city alderman. Brackenridge bought that property. He sold it. He built a home there, and in addition to a home was already there, built that, and it was purchased by the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word, and is now of course, the campus of the University of the Incarnate Word, immediately to the north of Brackenridge Park.
And Brackenridge had a whole bunch of land in that area, but it's kind of hard to maybe describe, but that pump house pumped water from the river that came down a raceway from, say, the Blue Hole area at that dam, and pumped it up to where is now the Botanical Garden, where the water reservoir was. What it
was the water right there at the northern end of Brackenridge Park came down to the river in a point where it could be there was a heavy flow, it could be deflected, and something like an 80-foot raceway was dug straight to the pump house, which is on the opposite bank of the San Antonio River. So the water drained into the San Antonio River. But before it did, it fell about 9 feet and powered turned two turbines at the lower level of the pump house, which then powered the two pumps up above on the floor above, which in turn sent the water through pipes about a mile or two southeast up the hill to what is now the San Antonio Botanical Garden, and it went into the city's first reservoir, which is now part of the Botanical Gardens amphitheater.
And it went up the.
From there, the water flowed downhill.
Yeah, it was so really it was like an acequia in terms of the water from the reservoir. Everything else was downhill. So the pipes, they could pipe it downhill to the rest of San Antonio, pretty much. Yeah,
but the acequias followed a very gentle flow. The raceway was dug for the maximum speed to get the water going as fast as it could, so that by the time it hit those turbine blades, it would be strong enough to really get some use out of it.
And then down from that reservoir is where the rest of San Antonio was, because it was up even higher than Brackenridge Park.
The reservoir is one of the highest points in the city. Of course, the city grew, and pretty soon we needed more than one pump house, but there wasn't really a good spot right there to do it. So just to the west of that, right near across from what's now the Kaler Pavilion, they found a way to engineer another raceway that actually was a mile long to a second pump house, which is now on in part of the golf course area, right near the golf course clubhouse, where a second pump house was built. And that gave a fall of the water of 9 feet as it was to the north, but 12 feet, which meant you could have a strong flow of water powering more pumps. And that is the pump house where once the city stopped using river water and went to artesian wells, and that pump house was no longer used. It became the studio of the sculptor Gutzen Borglum, who designed some of his early models for Mount Rushmore in that pump house.
I was surprised that they only used the water from the river in the pump house for a fairly short time, because as soon as they started digging any artesian wells, the level of the river dropped in the springs and the Blue Hole, so that there wasn't that much of a river flowing. I mean, that was early in San Antonio's history. We had water issues.
Yes, it was. It was as early as the 1890s. They finally found a really strong place for artesian wells down on Market Street, right across behind the Hilton Hotel, where water is still pumped. And that supplemented water, which is still pumped. There are still wells in Brackenridge Park supplying the water. But many of the trees began to dry up. A lot of the trees at the headwaters, Brackenridge's home, began to dry up, and they had to Brackenridge had to sell as a result of that. He just
well, yeah, I guess they say he was sad. Some of the nuns of Incarnate Word say the story
right.
goes that he was sad that he could look down and
Yeah.
see his baby drying up.
Yeah. Yeah, he had it did. Also, it didn't help that his mother had died about the same time, and that made it area depressing for him.
And so he wanted to get rid of this land. He had a whole lot of land, but how did it work first that he sold some to the sisters, and there was some stories there, and then he gave the rest of some of the rest of the land to the city?
Well, he sold he did not expect to sell to the sisters. Sister Madeline was the founder of the sisters, and she went to George Brackenridge looking to buy about 10 acres. And he said, no, you have to buy all 180 of my estate here, and you've got 2 weeks to do it for the equivalent of today, I think about $2 million. And then he went back to his business, figuring he'd never hear from her again. And she showed up with the money, and he sold it. That left him with a lot of other property in the area, but the waterworks land was it was in a floodplain. You couldn't really build on it and directly along the river, but also there was a change in the city government at the time, and a more forward-looking city government came into office that had people who felt more like George Brackenridge. One, the new park commissioner at the time was named Ludwig Monkey. He had the Monkey Hotel right on the site of where the Gunter is right now. And he and the mayor at the time, Marshall Hicks, convinced George Brackenridge that that land would make a fine park. And George Brackenridge agreed and gave about 200 acres which is about half the area that the park now encloses.
And some of that land before he gave it away had been Spanish-American War camps and a horse track.
That's another rabbit hole I find myself going down in this book, and that's what dragged it out. But it turned out.
But it turned fascinating, I thought.
Well, it did. There was a racetrack that was built on the site by Herman Campman, the son who he had his father. I guess he had his father's money. John Campman was a wealthy contractor, so Herman Campman buys the Menger Hotel, and then he decides to get in on the action of one of the biggest events in San Antonio at the time, which was the International Fair, co-sponsored by the city of San Antonio and the Mexican government. That was held down at what's now Roosevelt Park, down on south of San Antonio, far south of the downtown area. Campman thought he could do a better job closer to that. He bought some land. He and the Jockey Club, the San Antonio Jockey Club, built a racetrack better in some ways than the one that was down on the International Fairgrounds, and put in a bid to have the International Fair, to try to get the International Fair to move up to the Jockey Club. And this was right about on the site of the third green now of the Brackenridge Park Golf Course. That did not work out. But in 1897, right after the racetrack had closed, there was the 4th Texas Volunteer Regiment had been raised to serve in the Spanish-American War. They needed a place to go where there was a lot of water, enough water, and so they took over the old racetrack complex. They had the canteen for the enlisted men was right below the racetrack building, and that old canteen. The officers had the old clubhouse of the Jockey Club. And so for about 4 months, right at the end of the Spanish-American War, you had a Spanish-American war camp right within Brackenridge Park. A few months later, after the war was over, there was an insurrection in the Philippines, which needed some U.S. troops to put down. So they went back to the racetrack and raised the 33rd U.S. Infantry in the old grounds. That was called Camp Capron. And they were recruited and trained there for about 3 months, then marched in formation down to the Southern Pacific Depot and took the train to San Francisco, boarded the troop ship for Manila, and became one of the outstanding units in the Philippine Insurrection War. And they were all trained in what became Brackenridge Park. And right after that, of course, there was no more use for that land, so Brackenridge sold it or gave it to the city.
And that's one of those stories I think a lot of us had never heard about. I don't know if you had ever heard about it. Why do you think we don't know so much about what happened there?
Well, for one thing, they tore the racetrack down. They took the racetrack down in 1900. It was no longer viable, and they didn't take it down. They were there for periods for a short time. This was all within a period of about a year and a half. And again, nobody really was keeping close records in San Antonio, keeping close tabs on things. And it was just a blip. It was outside downtown. It was near Fort Sam Houston, but not part of Fort Sam Houston. And it just got overlooked. The way I found it in a strange way. I found a reference to a beer garden on Limburger's Beer Garden, right across from where the Woody Museum is now. And so I Googled Limburger's Beer Garden, and all of a sudden the Spanish-American War records came up. And it turned out that the soldiers from the Spanish-American War camp had stripped the beer garden of all the furniture and carried it down to the camp. So that made the records, and then that became a trail to follow.
One of the questions that we just are having now in the chat, by the way, if you're watching this, you can go ahead in the chat and ask questions. We'll try to relay to I want to call you Dr. Fisher, because you should be, Louis Fisher. You should get your doctorate for this book. Question was, Miraflores, does Brackenridge include stories about Dr. Urrutia and his gardens and sculpture there?
Well, among the many layers of history of Brackenridge Park is, of all things, the Mexican Revolution, the effects of the Mexican Revolution. A prominent doctor from Mexico, Dr. Aureliano Urrutia, fled the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and moved to San Antonio. He had a hospital in Mexico, outside Mexico City, sort of a sanitarium with gardens where the patients could relax, and they were sort of restorative gardens, is what they were known as. So he bought some land that George Brackenridge never had, right at the corner of Broadway and Hildebrand, about 15 acres that stretched from Broadway all the way down to the San Antonio River, where he planned a hospital and a garden. The hospital was never built, but the Miraflores Gardens were built on about 4.5 acres at the western end by the San Antonio River. And like everything else in San Antonio and in Brackenridge Park, it was helping hands at home. He had no training in landscape architecture, but he had a really good sense of aesthetics. He brought a lot of prominent Mexican artists and sculptors to contribute to the gates and the statuary in the park, and had plantings. And it became a very, almost a quixotic garden that had elements of the great gardens in Mexico, but was here in San Antonio. The land was, what would have been the hospital land was sold to USAA, and then Southwestern Bell and AT&T followed it. The gardens declined. And just at the time the gardens were going to be bulldozed for a parking lot, there was a deal made, and the city gained ownership to the Miraflores Gardens, which are directly across the river from Brackenridge Park. And that was incorporated in Brackenridge Park, and a very too slow and ongoing restoration project is underway.
And that's I guess the latest edition, but let's back way up until the very beginning, when he donated this, and Ludwig Manke, we now call Manke Park, his friend, was given the task of developing this park, he wasn't given much money, and it was a whole different kind of park because San Pedro Park was already here, but this was supposed to be a different kind of park. Tell us
Yeah,
about that.
it was to be a driving park. Central Park started as a driving park. That was the fad in the latter part of the 19th
Carriages.
century. Yeah, you get away from downtown, you take a carriage ride through the trees, and Brackenridge Park was very dense forests and trees. But then things changed. Parks became used more for recreation than just for contemplation. And that happened to be about the time that the method of city government changed from the ward system to the commission form of government, where city commissioners were essentially city councilmen, but each was put in charge of a different city department, like police and fire. And in the case of parks, it went to a former saloon keeper named Ray Lambert, who had no training whatever in parks, but he had a very lively imagination, was highly energetic, and began a number of shoestring projects to make the park distinctive. He brought in a lot of rock work with the old cement plant that had been started in the 1880s. He turned one of the quarry pits into the Japanese tea garden and a sunken garden, and there was a quarry pit on the other side that became the location of the sunken garden theater. But Lambert also created what's known as Lambert Beach, which is right near the Upper Pump House. He established the first public children's playground in San Antonio was at Lambert Beach. And he was a person who was, things in San Antonio may seem like they're happening in a vacuum, but there are a lot of parallels with other parts of the country. For instance, his contemporary in New York City as Parks Commissioner was a gentleman by the name of Robert Moses, who may or may not have been a gentleman, depending on your point of view. But he was also an entrepreneur who was dealing with a city that was maybe not as penurious with its parks, but they had issues up there too. So where we had in San Antonio, we had Ray Lambert going to with the clout to get through to George Brackenridge to make some additional financial donations to Brackenridge Park. There was Robert Moses up there with the clout to go to John D. Rockefeller. So everything, it's on a kind of a scale, and you have to wonder, Robert Moses was able to take some of the New Deal funds and persuade them to do projects that he thought should be done. And you have to wonder what Ray Lambert would have done had he lived long enough. He died in 1927. But during the time that he lived, he really set the basis for the Brackenridge Park that we know. He set the form, and many of the elements of the park existed. Then after he died and the Depression came, the city had drastic cutbacks across the board. Its budget was cut 40% in 1931, and 60 park workers were let go. So the maintenance dropped off very abruptly. That was sort of hidden masked by the number of New Deal projects that were built in the park, especially in the zoo. Cages were built, and there were new roadways built and other facilities in the park that went up, but all the while it was not being maintained. And so by the 1940s and 50s, we had a serious problem in the park. And that really is where a lot of our present problems date from. Some of the trees that now are big trees in Brackenridge Park should have been cut as saplings back in the 1940s, so they wouldn't knock over some of be in danger of destroying some of the buildings or tipping the river walls back into the river, but they weren't, and so we have sort of the after effects, the legacy of that now.
And now back to Ray Lambert, the Japanese tea garden, which was Japanese tea garden, then Chinese, and then Japanese again.
Right. Right.
He thought it was going to be a lily pond, and then I guess the theme of Japanese was a big was kind of popular across the country at the time, and that's
Yeah,
where that came from.
he enjoyed going out hunting, and his connection with nature was what he saw when he was out hunting, and he appreciated things. He looked down in the pit, the big pit one time, and he thought, well, that'd make a fine fern garden down there. So he had a plan for a fern garden, and then he took a look around at the popularity of Japanese themes in throughout the country, if not the world at the time. And the fern garden became a lily garden, which became evolved into the Japanese tea garden. And that essentially became very quickly at the most photographed spot in San Antonio after the Alamo. People loved to come out and see it, in spite of the fact that some of the architecture is a bit more Chinese than Japanese, and it really is not a terribly professionally designed thing, but it's so unusual and so distinctive that it is San Antonian.
And he then found and recruited a Japanese artist and his family to live there and to run it, so it did become authentically Japanese.
It did. Now, Dr. Urrutia next door had brought up from Mexico Dionisio Rodriguez, who was one of the great trabajo rustico or faubois artists. He made these incredible sculptures and structures out of cement, made them look like wood. Dr. Urrutia introduces Dionisio to Ray Lambert, who immediately picks up on him, and we have some of the great landmarks in Brackenridge Park as a result, especially the bridge, the elongated arcade right near Lambert Beach, and some other facilities there too.
And the Texas Star Garden was where the Sunken Garden Theater is now. That's what Ray Lambert thought would make a good, I guess, garden for a while, and then people realized the acoustics were good and they needed to put a kind of band shell there.
Yes, he thought that a floral garden in the shape of a Texas star was just the thing, until they realized the area had some acoustics, and then it drew, there had been a lot of interest in the Japanese theme in the 1910s. By the 1920s and 30s, you had a lot of interest in civic opera. Gilbert and Sullivan became very popular. And so that sort of drove the need for an outdoor theater, which was built on the site of the Texas Star Garden. And it's one of the
And
great—
the zoo, there was a zoo and I guess a small museum for a time in San Pedro Park. But the zoo wasn't originally supposed to be where it is now.
No.
Was that a Lambert decision?
We've got the zoo thanks to Ray Lambert, because when he took office, San Antonio was a growing city. We had we were trying to attract tourists, especially in the wintertime. This is where the sun spent the winter, after all. In the north, you're frozen. You're trying to play golf, and you're frozen off the course. So they pretty quickly decided to turn practically the southern half of Brackenridge Park into a golf course. The only problem was that on the site of the golf course was where George Brackenridge had purchased a small herd of bison and elk and other animals that had to go somewhere. So Ray Lambert takes a look at the place where they thought a zoo could go if anybody ever got the energy to put one over, which was behind the Woody Museum. He said, well, that won't work. Why don't we move it up to those cliffs in the quarry where nature has done their work for us, and they've built a good part of the cages already. So he was able to get the buffalo, and that's another story. How do you get buffalo to move? That took some doing, which is related in the book. But they got the buffalo and the elk moved up to the present location of the San Antonio Zoo, and that's how we got the San Antonio Zoo established.
And there was a San Antonio Zoological Society that ran it free, basically. The city put some money in, but you could walk into the zoo from the rest of the park up until, I guess, the early 40s, the late 30s. What happened
1940,
there?
Yeah, the first guidebook that the Zoological Society put out was entitled the San Antonio Zoological Garden. That's what it was. It was part of the park. But then, unfortunately, vandals came in and did some bad work, and animals were let out, and so they put a fence around it and charged admission, and greatly changed the landscape of the park, the viewscape of the park at that point with fences. Which
And the Whitty Museum, the story of the Whitty, it was starting to be built in San Pedro Park when somebody died. Tell that story. I think that's a fascinating one. What could have been.
Both the zoo and the museum, as you've indicated, they're originally very small private institutions in San Pedro Park. They closed about 1900. There were plans to put a zoo and a museum in Brackenridge Park, but no one came forward with the funds to do it. So the zoo was moved to another site, leaving the opening for the need for a museum. And so a movement led by a teacher at Main Avenue High School named Ellen Quillen set up a plan for a museum to be built. At that time, there was the mayor gave the city, gave the museum permission to build in San Pedro Park. And just as they were beginning to put in the foundations, a real estate man named Alfred Whitty died. Well, he apparently had never gotten the message that the museum was going to be built in San Pedro Park, because he left the equivalent of, I think it was $1 million in today's budget, in today's currency. He left that money for a museum to be built in the original location in Brackenridge Park. So if they didn't build it in Brackenridge Park, they wouldn't get his money. So they didn't take them very long to figure out, we're going to put our museum in Brackenridge Park. And in 1926, the Whitty Museum opened.
And what are some of the problems that developed over the years? Now, you said when you first got into the project, I think people, you were thinking a coffee table book, it's great, but there are some, I don't want to say hidden issues that need to be dealt with, but issues that a lot of us don't realize have to be worked on before the park is too far gone in some ways, in some places.
Well, this is what happened. I mentioned the intervention that happened when the Cultural Landscape Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., came down and had a super summit conference, really, of landscape architects and others from throughout the country. The net result of that was a study called the Cultural Landscape Report that was commissioned to a firm named Reed Hildebrand in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Suzanne Turner and Associates, landscape architects in Baton Rouge. And they put together a massive report that studied the park, where it came from as best they could determine, and what the problems currently were. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Center at the University of Texas at Austin was enlisted to come up with tactics. And the net result of that was about I was probably the first person to weigh the report. It was 5.5 pounds, to give you an idea of how weighty that report was.
Wow.
But it said basically, cut out the plop and drop. Before you do anything else, let's stand back, take a look at what needs to be done, and then do it in a very orderly manner. For instance, the banks of the river are, in most cases, where the walls are not tumbling into the river, they're compacted, they erode very easily, the plantings are gone, they need to be prepared in a very precise manner to have to make sense ecologically. There are invasive species throughout the park. The southern part of the park, bamboo is growing where it shouldn't. There are others that are crowding out native species. They need to be cleared out. You may remember the spring, the Conservancy got 160 goats to come in, and they cleared 7 acres of thorn bush and others that nobody really wants to do on their own. And these are the sorts of things that are being done. Those, and I mentioned the careful attention being paid to the restoration of the northern part of the park, all being done in a very orderly, scientific and manner that will have long-term viability.
And a few things that we remember from more recent years: sky ride, paddle boats, things like that. There's some pie in the sky talk about the sky ride, maybe from Tim Morrow of the zoo, but you also say paddle boats likely to have, or more likely to happen, other things like that, to kind of bring back some of the memories that those of us had from decades ago.
Right. One of the remarkable things about the Brackenridge Park Conservancy up to this point is that it has no funding source. The zoo, for instance, has the zoo train, the miniature train, which produces great revenue to support the zoo. One of the areas that the city has assigned to the Conservancy as a potential revenue source are the paddle boats, restoring the paddle boats, but also more immediately restoring the Sunken Garden Theater, which is in a state of decay and needs to be brought up to date as a sort of a mid-sized venue for concerts, which would produce substantial revenue for the Conservancy, which would then turn the funds back into upgrading the park, and you have this sort of this self-renewing cycle of funding to improve the park.
And we're way over time here. I'm sorry I kept you. We talked about we're getting you into the weeds on the details.
This is going until midnight easily.
Well, I don't know that they'll
I
let
fall
us.
asleep, but
yes, I'm
probably
sorry.
talking myself.
Well, what is your favorite part of this book? The favorite part that you worked on, that you found out when you describe this to somebody? What do you get most excited about?
Well, I think it is the evolution of the park, the layers that are not actually visible. I titled one chapter "Adrift." I had no idea that the park was foundering and was adrift, that maintenance was not being done, that terrible things were happening and being ignored, but I was able to pull that together and document it and then go into a period of renewal, which also was difficult to document, but once you put all the pieces together, the story was right there. But also finding out what a hero Ray Lambert was, and how it's been generally known that Ray Lambert built the Sunken Garden and Ray Lambert did Lambert Beach, but beyond that, we haven't really known about his thought processes, about how he developed things and how spontaneous so much of his work was, and how well it fits into the whimsical nature of San Antonio itself.
And a last quick question or two. Brackenridge, this book, since you found out so much, are you looking to do a Brackenridge Part 2 down the road? Do you think there's enough?
Not today.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But down the road, do you have another book in mind yet, or are you just kind of relaxing?
No, I didn't have the Brackenridge Park book in mind a year before I started it. These things just sort of bubble up from beneath. Right now, I'm in a recovery stage.
Well, thank you again. I made it harder for you because I interviewed you for hours for this KLRN thing, which, like you, I don't know if I'll ever get done. But
well, as you can tell, I didn't run out of soap, so
yes,
more to come.
I really appreciate it. And for more information, again, the book, in fact, you have this Saturday, you're going to be at a Barnes & Noble.
It's a week from Saturday at Barnes & Noble at San Pedro Crossing near North Star Mall, and the week after that at the Barnes & Noble in La Cantera. And I think it's the first week in December at the Twig in the Pearl.
And again, the book is called officially Brackenridge Park, San Antonio's Acclaimed Urban Park. Right. By Louis Fisher. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for the people at Trinity University Press for allowing me to grill you even further about all of this. I do have more questions, but I won't ask you right now. Thanks very much. Thanks you all for joining in. This you can share with other people. It'll be on this website and I believe on this Facebook page as well. Thanks for tuning in. And Louis, I'll let you sign it off since you've done so much work.
Well, I'll sign it off with a big thank you to Randy and to Trinity University Press for its patience as we've all worked through this. Thanks. And the Brackenridge Park Conservancy, of course, which is a co-sponsor of and co-publisher of the book.